I'd like a big Kiwanis welcome for Alan Lertzman, please.
Mike is passing out a map of the entire Korean Peninsula, but for those of you who not like to see a little larger portrait, I have the big map. Can you all see that okay? All right. Okay, well, Mike is passing out handouts and also a copy of this map, and I'll be referring to both the handouts and the map as we go along. Anyway, thank you for inviting me to discuss my observations about the Korean War. As Mike mentioned in the introduction, I'm part of a veterans group who visit local high schools. I believe future generations should understand why we got involved in the Korean War and what was accomplished. Before I go any further, I want you all to know I did not do anything heroic. I did not compare to some of the other real fighting other American soldiers experienced in that war. However, I did win one war. Last week, I got the word from my oncologist. The results of a CAT scan last week indicated I'm now cancer-free. So, after 7 years of chemotherapy treatments at the VA hospital in Portland, I'm a cancer survivor, and my souvenir is my bald head. So, let's get to work here. It's my understanding I'm allotted 30 minutes. And I got 30 minutes to cover a 3-year war and my visit to South Korea last week, Republic of South Korea. I'd like to break the presentation into 2 parts. First, my impression of today's South Korea, and then some observations about the war and my personal experiences. After the armistice was signed on July 27th, 1953, I entered the city of Seoul. All I could see was a city of ashes and smoke. I don't think I saw a building over 2 stories. After the absolute ruins of the city 60 years ago, it would have been pretty impossible to have imagined Seoul today as a modern, vibrant city with soaring skyscrapers and a country with a strong economic system. South Korea is 10 years ahead of most countries, including the United States, in terms of technology and a well-organized system. The estimates were it might take over 100 years to rebuild the country, but with our financial help, it only took 60 years. For example, the Incheon Airport, where we land, is ranked #1 as the most efficient airport in the world. Another example is at the end of the war, South Korea had only 1 bridge, still intact. Now they have 23 bridges with amazing designs, and buildings in Seoul have incredible architecture in their buildings. Mike has a photo that I like to just pass it around. This photo was taken at the hotel we were staying, and on the wall of the lobby in the hotel, an entire wall was a poster welcoming all of the UN veterans. And I have to tell you that we were treated with so much respect that it was almost embarrassing. I mean, they couldn't do enough for us. And as you will see later on some of the handouts, some of the gifts on the table, you can see some of the things they gave us so that we remember them as well. Next to the hotel, by the way, next to our hotel, they're building a skyscraper, 123 stories high. If you can believe that. Now, it will be completed in 2015, I understand. So South Korea is an economic miracle and has become a rich and powerful country and a symbol of democracy, which is envied by the world. For many years, South Korea sponsored a revisit program for veterans of the United States and other UN nations to thank them for the freedom and economic success of their country, as Mike pointed out. As a participant in the recent visit, as I mentioned, our group was treated with so much respect and courtesy, it was unbelievable. Now, about the war. As you can see in the handouts, there were many battles. However, for our purpose this evening, I'm going to break the war down into 4 stages. First stage, the battle at the Pusan Peninsula. Please note, on page 2, the date August 4th, and the map showing the location of the Nangtang River along the Pusan perimeter. You can see here, here's the peninsula down here, here's Pusan. You see the North Koreans invaded South Korea coming down over the 30th parallel, down the route here, and captured Seoul and moved all the way down. You know, the South Korean army was ill-equipped and very small, and so they're really no match for the North Korean army. After the Korean army crossed the 38th parallel, they did push down to the Pusan perimeter, and I have some photos that you can see later on after the presentation is over. This was the first major battle of the war. You will note on the handouts, U.S. casualties was 4,600 killed, 12,000 wounded, 2,100 missing in action. Some other facts, not well known, the hundreds of Americans captured in the early months of the war were massacred by the North Korean army. Chinese were good fighters, and the North Koreans were cruel. This is documented as pointed out on some of the dates of the handouts. August 17th on page 2, August 17th, September 19th, October 9th, 20th, and 23rd points out the number of Americans that were killed by the North Koreans. Our group was taken to the Nangtang River site where the South Korean Army conducted their reenactment of the battle, including a helicopter performance and a landing demonstration by hundreds of Korean commandos. To display some realism, they even had soldiers dressed in North Korean uniforms and waving North Korean flags as they attacked the South Korean and U.S. Army. By the way, today, South Korea has the 6th largest and most efficient army in the world. Really very impressive. Now, the second stage of the war. That was the Incheon landing on the west coast of Korea, dated September 15th. You look at your handouts, and here's the map. Here we are at Incheon. This is very important. This is interesting. While the fighting around the Pusan perimeter was going on, General MacArthur was preparing to reverse the direction of the war by conducting a surprise amphibious landing at the port city of Incheon, similar to the Normandy landing in World War II. The Incheon landing became one of the most brilliant moves in American military history. No other nation in the world had the means and knowledge to put together on such short notice over 200 ships to land 70,000 troops successfully. By now, a well-equipped and cohesive U.S. force was able to recapture Seoul within a few days. The North Koreans were caught by surprise and were no match for the Marines and GIs. North Korean army was utterly destroyed. And the UN forces pushed them all the way back up to the Chinese border. All the way back up here to the Chinese border. From Incheon all the way up here. MacArthur managed to save a war that frankly was being lost. People don't realize how serious that whole situation was at that time. I cannot overestimate how important the Incheon landing was, and in spite of later miscalculations by MacArthur that the Chinese would not enter the war, this was a huge success for him. We were fortunate to attend the 63rd anniversary of this landing on September 15th. That's when we were all there. All 120 of us in our group, veterans, and witnessed the Korean military enact landing with destroyers, landing crafts, helicopters, and fighters, aircraft. It was an amazing demonstration by the South Korean Army, Air Force, and Navy. Steven Spielberg could not have directed a better production that we witnessed in both the reenactment of the Pusan perimeter battle and Incheon landing. The 80% of Incheon's area was destroyed during the Korean War, 80%. Yet Incheon was recently ranked second in terms of growth potential among the world's cities. Third stage. This was the entrance of China into the war. China decided to come to the aid of North Korea. In late November 1950, 300,000 Chinese communists crossed into the border from China, and it was a brilliant feat of mass infiltration, and began an attack on the UN forces. Their first targets was the U.S. Army and Marines stationed at the Chosun Reservoir. And here again, look on your map. Here's the Chosun Reservoir, and here's where they came down. They came down across the river here, Yalu River, into North Korea. Of the over 120,000 Chinese surrounded these smaller positions at the Chosun Reservoir. Please note on page 3 of the handouts, November 27th, the Chinese attacked a U.S. task force of less than 3,000 soldiers and killed the entire unit. Today, the remains of the unknown men who fell there still lie unmarked in North Korea. The counteroffensive did not fare any better, with only 385 soldiers of a 3,200 support force survived. 385 of 3,200 survived. The 1st Marine Division, stationed at the Chosun Reservoir, also suffered many casualties, including more than 3,000 killed, 600 wounded, plus hundreds who just froze to death. The weather was the worst in decades. 30 to 35 degrees below zero, freezing, wind chill factor of 100 degrees below zero. A Marine officer recalled that he had to constantly walk the line of gun emplacements to force the soldiers to keep moving, to prevent freezing. Lethargy was a death sentence. I didn't take this photo, but I'll pass this around. Give you an idea of what the weather conditions were at the Chosun Reservoir. It was brutal. The remaining Army and Marine units were ordered to retreat to the Hangnam Harbor on the East Coast, down here. And here's 67 miles to go from the Chosun Reservoir down to the Hangnam Harbor, where ships are waiting for them to take them back to South Korea. By the way, another item is not well known. 98,000 North Korean refugees were escorted by the Marines as they went from the Chosun area to the harbor. Today, there are over 1 million descendants of those 98,000 North Korean refugees. One of the problems we ran across, we talked to quite a few Korean, split families. There's families in North Korea and South Korea, and it's just awful what they did to separate all these families. Their progress was also delayed by a military tradition of never leaving a soldier behind, and the dead and wounded were loaded onto trucks. In order to fit the frozen bodies onto the trucks, the Marines had to break arms and legs in order to make room. I mention this to remind you there's nothing glamorous about warfare as depicted in the movies. It's ugly business. And I see no reason to sugarcoat some of the side effects of war. A total of 17 medals of honor, 70 Navy Crosses were awarded, making Chosun one of the most decorated battles in American history. By the end of December 1950, the UN forces were pushed all the way back from the to the 38th parallel and retreated from Seoul, which they had captured at the Incheon. They had to retreat and gave it back to the Chinese, who recaptured Seoul. Now, the battle lines are along the 38th parallel. On June 30th, the UN offered to open truce negotiations, and North Korea and China accepted. And now we're getting into the fourth stage of the war. And this was the battle for the hills. The negotiations were slow, difficult, and lasted for 2.5 years. Can you believe that? 2.5 years. The communists made every effort to force concessions through delay, and were in conference what they had been unable to attain on the battlefield. The agreement was that the U.S. forces would not cross north of the 38th parallel, and Chinese would not cross south of the 38th parallel. That was the beginning point of the negotiations. However, a ceasefire agreement was not included in the negotiations. The Chinese tried to occupy as many hills as possible in order to influence the truce talks. As a result, 30,000 more Americans lost their lives as the war now turned into trench warfare, similar to World War I. Actually, 46% of all our casualties had occurred not during 1950, but from 51 to 53, mostly during the Battle for the Hills. In your handouts, you will see, by the way, you can take these handouts home, show them to your family, as I think it's a good educational thing. I pass these handouts to all the students in the schools, and they ask good questions, by the way. In your handouts, you will see nicknames of the hills: Bloody Ridge, Heartbreak Ridge, Bunker Hill, Old Baldy, Pork Chop, and Outpost Harry, etc. During this fourth stage of the war, it's when I finally ended the war and won the war for everybody, of course. So let me share with you a little of my personal experience prior to my arrival in Korea. Back then, unlike today's military, we were not today's military all volunteers, as you all know. I was just one of many young civilians who were drafted in 1951. As I tell the students during visits to the high schools, this was their grandparents' war. We were young, not much older than most of the seniors today at Century or Glencoe High School, as it turns out. After basic training, I accepted an invitation to attend Artillery Anti-Aircraft Candidate School at Fort Bliss, Texas. Yeah, I figured, well, why not? I mean, maybe by the time I go to OCS, the war's going to be over. So I said, oh, okay, I'll go. Seemed like I'd be out of harm's way anyway, you know, shooting on airplanes. I did graduate, and I think I was last in my class, and I think also the shortest. After graduation, I received the commission as a second lieutenant and assigned to Air Defense Command on the East Coast. I was stationed at the headquarters of the Air Defense Command at Swarthmore College. Now, Swarthmore College was and is today an all-girl, upscale, all-girls college located on the outskirts of Philadelphia. Now here I am, a brand young second lieutenant, just out of OCS, stationed at all-girls college. Let me tell you, this was not bad duty, okay? Not bad duty. At that point, you know, I think I'm gonna make the Army a career. This is all right. Anyway, it was good duty, a good experience, but the war is still going on. 1953, March of 1953, the war is still going on, and I got my assignment that I was being transferred to Korea. I said, okay. I should have been suspicious because instead of putting me on a boat, they flew me there. I didn't know why, it was a big hurry to get me over there. When I arrived in Korea in early 1953, I was told the anti-aircraft specialists were no longer needed, as enemy aircraft were no longer a threat. Instead, I was instructed to be an artillery forward observer, assigned to the 7th Infantry Division, stationed on the front lines, facing the Chinese on a hill nicknamed Old Baldy. I told my superiors I had no training about the duties of an artillery forward observer. They said, no problem, Lieutenant. This will be on-the-job training, and assigned an experienced sergeant to teach me the ropes. I must tell you, being assigned to an infantry division on the front lines was not what I had anticipated when I left the States. I was informed that was to be a replacement. When I asked whom am I replacing, I was told there was a shortage of artillery forward observers because a large number had become casualties. Now put yourself in my shoes and you got this kind of information. How would you feel about things? I was issued a .45 revolver, a flak jacket, and escorted to the observation post facing Old Baldy. Now I'll pass, here's a photo of Old Baldy from my observation post. I'll pass this around. One thing you might notice is this Old Baldy had been taken and lost about 5 times. Chinese would take it, we would take it back, they would back and forth. There was not a tree or a shrub still growing. And that's the reason they called it Old Baldy. Nothing's growing. By the way, I took this photo with my Eastman Kodak Browning camera. Now I had to explain to the students what a Kodak Browning camera looked like. So I did. They said, it was not a smartphone, you know, it was something different. For those of us assigned for observer duty, this meant being literally on the front lines, close enough to see and observe enemy actions. For the purpose of giving fire support, were never needed. And the Chinese realized that knocking out these outposts meant eliminating some of our ability to fire on them. We were almost daily shelled by the Chinese artillery and mortar fire. Looking back on my experience, the power and responsibility was placed in 22, 23-year-old lieutenants like me was really interesting. A simple entry in my daily morning report usually had a statement like, received rounds, which was a polite way of saying we were targeted and fired on. One call from me on a field radio could bring in more destructive power than an entire infantry battalion. I got to know the squad leader and the platoon camp. By the way, I got to know the squad leader and the platoon commander during my assignment. On several occasions, I accompanied the infantry squad with my radio man to make sure the Chinese were not infiltrating into our space. If any veteran of combat tells you he was never scared, you know one thing, he was lying. Okay, going out on patrol was probably the scariest assignment I had while on the hill. It wasn't so much running into the Chinese, but the Bouncing Betty. I don't want to get into details, but you guys know what I'm talking about perhaps. But the Bouncing Betty booby traps, that was something planted in no man's land between our outpost and Old Baldy that really frightened me. Bouncing Betties, you know, up, and you lose all important things, you know. Here's a photo of shells landing on Old Baldy that I took with my Kodak Browning camera. You pass that around. You can see the power of those artillery shells. You know, the Chinese, what they do, they come out of their bunkers or tunnels and fire their mortars and run back in. So my job was to try to catch them before they got back into their tunnels. I have no idea how many Chinese became casualties or American lives saved as a result of my duties. The final part of my talk this evening is about the battle for Pork Chop Hill. For some of you who are old enough, probably remember Gregory Peck, Pork Chop Hill movie. It left a lasting impression on me. Please note on page 5, the date July 6th, the Battle of Pork Chop Hill. This hill is to the right of my outpost, I think about a half a mile to the right of my outpost. And on the night of that date, I do recall, it was really during a heavy monsoon rainfall, the Chinese, using massive number of infantry troops, attacked Pork Chop in an attempt to occupy that hill. Recall I said they were really trying to get as much terrain as possible to influence the truce talks. It was a typical Chinese human wave attack, style of a moving carpet of Chinese swarming up the hill in perfect English. The Chinese were on their loudspeakers telling our troops to surrender, or if not, you're all going to die. Scary stuff. They announced they're going to take Pork Chop, and they would take no prisoners. This is all in perfect English. No words can describe what a horrific spectacle that I observed. The Chinese were ferocious fighters. If anybody said not good fighters, they don't know. They were ferocious fighters. And there was brutal, close quarter, hand-to-hand fighting. It was an indescribable hell. I was shocked by how fanatical the Chinese were. I don't know what it was about their culture that would send them right into heavy fire, and why they were so willing to fight to the death. I was told it had to do with honor. My job was direct fire on Chinese mortars on Obaldi, who were firing at our troops on Pork Chop. After only 5 days of fighting, the casualties on Pork Chop include 243 killed, 916 wounded, and 163 of our dead have never been recovered. Now I'm telling you, 5 days of fighting. Can you imagine 243 guys killed? Unbelievable. After the battle for Pork Chop, I had completed my assignment, promoted to first lieutenant, and reassigned to a radar observation post located behind the front lines. And I don't have time to tell you the duties, but it was to track incoming mortars coming from different Chinese positions. Another important battle took place in the last month of the war, and that was the battle for Outpost Harry. Would you pass the handouts about Outpost Harry? Please note on page 5 of the handout the date, June 10th. This is a story of forgotten warriors and a forgotten war, and a forgotten battle, of a forgotten war. You can, as you read the handout, the description of that battle, they were told to hold at all costs, and they did. Out of 200 stationed on the hill, only 30 walked out alive. But they held the hill. This was the thing is that this was a very strategic military hotspot and dearly desired by the Chinese. The Chinese wanted to recapture Seoul, and Outpost Harry was the only obstacle in their way. But these guys on Outpost Harry, they said, can't let the Chinese through. And they suffered horrendous casualties. By the way, there's a video, 10-minute video of Outpost Harry. You can go to Google and just click on Hold at All Costs, and you'll get a 10-minute video of the battle of. This was taken not by actors. This was an army photographer who didn't know what he was getting into, but these are real shots of the battle of Outpost Harry. Very fascinating. After my transfer, I was looking back on my tour of duty in Korea. I was pretty lucky. Let's face facts. I was not a forward observer either in Pork Chop or on Outpost Harry, and my outpost had not been attacked by the Chinese during my assignment on the hill. After my transfer to the radar station, I was told the night before the arms were signed, the Chinese did attack my former outpost, Westview. And unfortunately, my replacement was killed. Forward observers are trained to call in artillery rounds called flash fire, where the shells explode above the bunkers if they are overrun by the enemy. Anyone above our bunker would then be either wounded or killed. I'm guessing my replacement did not believe the Chinese would attack the day before the signing of the armistice, and really was unprepared for an infiltration. I really felt very bad about that whole situation, why he was there, why they attacked. I assume the Chinese decided to finish the war in a blaze of glory. The Korean War is called the Forgotten War because it was sandwiched between World War II, the greatest generation, you all know the story there, and the controversies of the Vietnam War, which you all know, of course, since you're of that age area group. I suggest it could also be known as the bloodiest war in the 20th century. 40,000 Americans died, and more than 104,000 were wounded in the most horrific combat and weather conditions in the history of warfare. The number of South Koreans, listen to this is fascinating. The number of South Koreans killed in the war was much worse. 415,000 South Koreans were killed. 415,000. And 430,000 were wounded. And you think about all the widows and all the orphans, and just a tragedy that affected this South Korean country. Awful. On your handouts, I'd like to call your attention to page 6, which were comments by Eric Severide 60 years ago. This broadcast was done in 1953. But it could have been done this year as well. Instead of Korea, just substitute Afghanistan as a country. Today, as then, our military fought with a sense of honor, knowing the country was divided about the very purpose of their fight. And here's after the armistice was signed, some people got on top of our bunkers, and you can see where we lived. So I'll pass this around if you'd like to see what the bunkers looked like. And this is my bunker. It used to be my bunker. And when I go to the high schools, I like to show the students a before and after. So first of all, I show them before. This is me, just graduating from Officers Candidate School and stationed at Swarthmore College. Handsome devil, wasn't he?
What happened?
Yeah, what happened? Okay, now the next picture is a photo of me after my tour of duty in Korea and after seeing horror things I could never imagine ever seeing in my life. So here I am after my tour of duty in Korea, before and after. You can see a different tenor and attitude perhaps in my feelings about the war. And by the way, my hat, Korean hat, guess where this hat was made? China. Now, 60 years ago, I was looking for Chinese on Old Baldy to fire on them. And today I'm wearing their hat. Ironic, huh? God bless America, and thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to. We have time for questions, fine. On the display table are some gifts we received from the South Koreans. They couldn't do enough for us. And some photos I took with my smartphone. Not a Browning camera, but a smartphone. And the reenactments of the battles of the Pusan Perimeter and the Battle of Incheon were remarkable. And there are thousands of people, South Koreans, who were there. They take so much pride in their country, you can't believe. In all of the tours, we were there for a whole week. Not one building did I ever see that had any graffiti. The streets were clean. The people were marvelous and patient and courteous. So anyway, that was my experience in South Korea, and I do thank you very much. If you have any questions, please feel to ask. Yes, ma'am.